Imagine settling onto your porch, coffee in hand, savoring the quiet of your lakeside retreat, your slice of paradise. Then, out of nowhere, a woman in a rhinestone tank top and 3-inch heels struts down your gravel driveway, brandishing a clipboard like it's a royal decree. Apparently, my grandfather's dock, doesn't match the HOA's precious waterfront aesthetic. I didn't argue, I just smiled, nodded, and pulled out the old, weathered land deed that makes their entire HOA rulebook look like a kid's crayon sketch on scrap paper. Ever seen an HOA president's smug grin vanish when they realize they're the ones trespassing? Oh, you're in for a wild ride. This story unravels faster than a cheap sweater, and I've got all the juicy details to prove it. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontation with an HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. My name's Lucas Thompson, and I'm a 35-year-old retired hydrologist who used to work for the Department of Natural Resources. I inherited this lakeside cabin from my grandfather just last year, and let me tell you, it's been quite the journey. My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran who bought this land back in the 1960s, long before any of these fancy houses sprouted up around the lake. The cabin itself is nothing special, just a modest 2-bedroom structure with weathered cedar siding and a green metal roof that's seen better days, but it sits on what I now realize is prime real estate. The property extends right down to the water's edge, where my grandfather built a sturdy wooden dock back in 1967. I'd moved here hoping for peace and quiet, figuring I could do some freelance environmental consulting while enjoying the simple life by the water. Boy, was I wrong about the quiet part. The young woman standing at my door that morning looked like she'd raided a discount costume shop. Her name, as I'd soon learn, was Brenda Rutherford, and she was 30 years old, but trying way too hard to look 21. She wore a hot pink tank top with Boss Lady spelled out in rhinestones, black shiny leggings that looked like they were made of plastic wrap, and those ridiculous red high heels that were clearly not designed for walking on gravel driveways. Her makeup was applied with what must have been a trowel, featuring electric blue eyeshadow and shocking pink lipstick that matched her tank top. Behind her stood 2 other HOA board members, both looking significantly more uncomfortable than their fearless leader. One was a middle-aged man in a polo shirt who kept checking his watch, and the other was a woman in her 40s wearing a floral dress who seemed to be questioning her life choices. Brenda immediately launched into what she probably thought was a friendly welcome speech, but which sounded more like a military inspection report. "Welcome to Pine Ridge Estates," she announced with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Brenda Rutherford, president of the Homeowners Association, and we're here to help you understand our community standards." She gestured dramatically at my cabin, with her long neon pink nails that had rhinestones glued to each tip. "Now I can see you're going to need to make some immediate improvements to bring this property up to our standards. The exterior paint color is completely non-compliant with our approved palette. The landscaping needs significant work to meet our guidelines, and that dock structure will need to be reviewed by our architectural committee for proper approval." I stood there in my old flannel shirt and jeans, probably smelling faintly of boat engine oil from working on my grandfather's ancient outboard motor, wondering if I'd somehow traveled to an alternate universe where common sense didn't exist. The thing that really got to me was how she kept referring to everything as ours and our standards, as if she owned the entire neighborhood. When I politely asked about these HOA rules, and when they'd been established, Brenda's smile became even more plastic. "Oh, honey, these standards have been in place since the development was established. Everyone who lives in Pine Ridge Estates is required to maintain certain standards to protect our property values." She handed me a thick folder filled with what looked like legal documents, color charts, and architectural guidelines that would have made a city planning department jealous. You'll want to review all of this carefully. We expect compliance within 30 days, or there will be fines. The way she said fines made it sound like a threat, which, as I'd soon discover, it absolutely was. What puzzled me most was that my grandfather had never mentioned anything about a homeowners association. He'd lived here for over 50 years and had always talked about how much he loved the freedom of lakeside living. After Brenda and her entourage finally left, I went through my grandfather's papers looking for any mention of an HOA, deed restrictions, or community guidelines. All I found were old tax records, the original deed from 1965, and various maintenance receipt. There was no mention of any homeowners association anywhere. I did, however, find something interesting tucked away in an old wooden box in the closet. An envelope marked "Mock Important Property Documents" in my grandfather's careful handwriting. The envelope was sealed and felt surprisingly thick, as if it contained more than just a few sheets of paper. That first encounter with Brenda left me feeling unsettled and confused. I'd moved to the cabin seeking tranquility and a simpler way of life, but instead I'd apparently landed in the middle of some kind of bureaucratic nightmare. The whole interaction felt surreal, like being scolded by a kindergarten teacher dressed for a 1980s disco party. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, particularly Brenda's insistence that the dock needed approval and that my grandfather's carefully maintained property was somehow substandard. Something about the whole situation didn't add up, and I had a feeling that envelope in the closet might hold some answers. I decided to open that envelope, and what I found inside would completely change the game with Miss Brenda. A week after Brenda's colourful visit, I received an official violation notice in my mailbox that made my blood pressure spike. The document was printed on fancy letterhead and looked like it had been drafted by a team of lawyers with too much time on their hands. The violation notice listed 3 major infractions: unauthorized dock structure, non-compliant exterior paint color, and landscaping violations. Each violation came with a detailed description that used enough legal jargon to make a law student's head spin. The total fine was $500 due within 15 days, or additional penalties would be applied. Attached to this cheerful document was a letter from one Cornelius Blackwood, attorney for Pineridge Estates' HOA, threatening legal action if I didn't immediately comply with all community standards and regulations. I called the number listed for Brenda Rutherford, hoping to have a reasonable conversation about these supposed violations. When she answered the phone, her tone was condescending enough to make me wonder if she practiced talking down to people in front of a mirror. "Oh, hello, Lucas," she said, in a voice that suggested she was speaking to a particularly slow child. "I was wondering when you'd call. Maybe you should have read the HOA bylaws before moving into our community, sweetie. These standards exist for a reason, and everyone has to follow them. We can't make exceptions just because someone's family has been here a long time." The way she emphasized our community made it clear she considered me an unwelcome intruder rather than a legitimate resident. When I tried to explain that my grandfather had never been subject to any HOA rules, she cut me off with a dismissive laugh. "Times change, honey. This isn't the Wild West anymore." Frustrated by the phone call, I decided to do some research into this HOA that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. I spent the better part of an afternoon reading through the documents Brenda had given me, cross-referencing them with online records, and trying to piece together a timeline. What I discovered was interesting to say the least. According to the paperwork, Pine Ridge Estates HOA was officially incorporated in 2018, just 5 years ago. The community guidelines were adopted that same year, along with architectural standards, landscaping requirements, and something called waterfront usage protocols. Here's the kicker. My grandfather bought his land in 1965, a full 53 years before this HOA even existed, The timeline made no sense whatsoever. My confusion deepened when I started looking at the property boundaries outlined in the HOA documents compared to what I remembered my grandfather showing me years ago. The HOA map seemed to include areas that I was pretty sure belonged to our family's original lot, including the waterfront access where our dock was located. I'd spent enough summers here as a kid to remember my grandfather walking me around the property lines, pointing out landmarks and explaining where our land ended and the next property began. The version of reality presented in these HOA documents didn't match my memories at all, but then again, I hadn't been here in years before inheriting the place. One evening, while I was sitting on the dock trying to make sense of everything, an elderly woman approached from the neighboring property. She introduced herself as Dorothy Weatherby, a 67-year-old retired librarian who'd been living in the area for 20 years. Dorothy had the kind of gentle demeanor that immediately put you at ease, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen enough of life to not be easily intimidated. "I couldn't help but notice all the commotion this week," she said with a knowing smile, "that Brenda Rutherford has been making quite a scene about your property." When I explained my confusion about the HOA regulations and the violations I'd received, Dorothy's expression grew serious. "Your grandfather's land was here long before any of these houses, honey. I remember when they were building the development and how careful they were to work around the existing properties. Something doesn't smell right about this whole situation." Dorothy suggested I check the county records to get a clear picture of my property boundaries and any easements or restrictions that might have been placed on the land over the years. "The county courthouse keeps detailed records of all property transfers, deed restrictions, and legal agreements," she explained. "If there's something official about this HOA business, it'll be in those files. And if there isn't, well, that tells you something too." She also mentioned that she'd been keeping an eye on things in the neighborhood and had noticed some irregularities in how the HOA had been operating. "They seem to think they have a lot more authority than they actually do, if you ask me. I've seen them bully several homeowners over the years, and most people just give in rather than fight." The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something fishy was going on. Brenda's aggressive tactics, the conveniently vague timeline, and the fact that my grandfather had never mentioned any restrictions on the property all pointed to a situation that deserved serious investigation. I decided that a trip to the county recorder's office was definitely in order. If this HOA had legitimate authority over my property, there would be official documentation to prove it. And if they didn't, well, Miss Brenda was about to learn that picking a fight with someone who understood environmental law and property rights was a very bad idea. I made plans to visit the county office first thing Monday morning. Dorothy had said something that stuck with me. "Your grandfather was a smart man who kept meticulous records. He wouldn't have left you in a situation where you didn't have the tools to defend yourself." I had a feeling she was right, and I was about to find out just how prescient my grandfather had been. What the clerk at the county office printed out for me was so shocking that I nearly didn't believe my own eyes. Monday morning found me at the Millbrook County Recorder Office, a surprisingly modern building that smelled like fresh coffee and copy paper. The clerk who helped me was a middle-aged woman named Evelyn, who had the enthusiastic demeanor of someone who genuinely loved helping people navigate bureaucratic mysteries. When I explained what I was looking for, her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that suggested she didn't get many interesting cases. "Oh, property boundary disputes. These are always fascinating," she said, leading me to a computer terminal. "Let's pull up everything we have on your property and see what story the records tell." What she found in the next 30 minutes would turn my understanding of the situation completely upside down. The official property deed showed that my grandfather hadn't just owned the cabin and a small lot around it. He owned a massive piece of land that extended far beyond what I'd imagined. According to the survey maps in the county database, Our property encompassed not just the cabin and immediate grounds, but also included significant portions of what the HOA claimed as community areas. The dock that Brenda had called unauthorized had been legally permitted and constructed in 1967 with all the proper environmental and structural permits filed with the county. More importantly, there was absolutely no record of any land transfer, easement, or agreement that would have given an HOA any authority over our property. The records clearly showed continuous ownership by the Thompson family from 1965 right up to the present day. Evelyn printed out copies of all the relevant documents, including the original deed, survey maps, and permit records. As I sat there, staring at the papers, she leaned over and said quietly, "You know, this kind of situation isn't as uncommon as you'd think. Sometimes new developments get built around older properties and people make assumptions about boundaries and authorities that aren't legally sound. The question is whether these HOA folks genuinely misunderstood the situation or if they're deliberately trying to pull something over on you." Her words echoed what Dorothy had suggested, but seeing it all laid out in official documents made the reality hit home. Not only did the HOA have no authority over my property, but they'd been operating under completely false assumptions about property boundaries. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I found that Brenda had escalated her campaign against me in my absence. There was a second violation notice taped to my door, this one with an even larger fine of $1,000 for failure to respond to initial violations and continued non-compliance with community standards. She'd also left several messages on my phone, each one more aggressive than the last. The final message informed me that she'd called an emergency HOA board meeting for that Friday to address what she termed the problematic property situation in our community. But that wasn't all. According to Dorothy, who called me that evening, Brenda had been going door to door, spreading rumors about me to the other neighbors. The confrontation scene that followed was something straight out of a bad reality TV show. I decided to go directly to Brenda's house to demand an explanation for the escalated violations and to present her with the county records I'd obtained. Her house was exactly what you'd expect, a 2-story McMansion with a 3-car garage, perfectly manicured lawn, and enough decorative flourishes to stock a home improvement store. When she answered the door, she was wearing a unicorn-themed sequin t-shirt and ripped denim shorts that had clearly been pre-distressed by someone who'd never done a day of actual physical labor in their life. "Well, well," she said with a smirk, "if it isn't our neighborhood troublemaker, come to Gravel for an extension on your fines." I kept my voice calm and professional as I explained that I'd done some research into the property boundaries and HOA authority. Before I could even show her the county document, she cut me off with a dismissive wave of her rhinestone-encrusted nails. "I don't care what some old papers say. This is my neighborhood now. These standards exist for a reason, and I don't care if your family has been squatting here since the Stone Age." That's when Cornelius Blackwood emerged from inside the house, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of cheap suit that tries to look expensive but fools no one. He threatened me with immediate legal action if I didn't comply with all HOA demands within 48 hours. When I mentioned that I discovered some interesting information about property ownership, I saw something flicker in Brenda's eyes that looked suspiciously like panic, though she covered it quickly with renewed aggression. "You think you can intimidate me? I've dealt with losers like you before." The interaction with the neighbors over the following days revealed a community divided and confused about the actual authority of their HOA. Chester Davidson, a 39-year-old contractor who lived 2 houses down, approached me privately after Brenda had made her rounds, spreading her version of events. "Look, I don't know what's really going on," he said, "but that woman has been making everyone's life miserable for years. If you found something that proves she doesn't have the authority she claims, a lot of us would be interested to hear about it." Several other neighbors had similar reactions, expressing frustration with Brenda's heavy-handed tactics and arbitrary rule enforcement. On the other hand, some residents seemed genuinely convinced that property values would plummet if HOA standards weren't rigidly maintained. Dorothy continued to be a source of support and practical advice throughout this escalating situation. She shared more details about Brenda's history in the neighborhood, including how she'd driven at least 2 families to sell their homes and move away rather than deal with her harassment. "The woman has serious control issues," Dorothy explained. "She moved here 3 years ago after a messy divorce and immediately set about trying to turn this place into her personal kingdom. Most people just pay the fines and try to stay out of her way, but you're the first person to actually challenge her authority with real documentation." Dorothy encouraged me to stand firm, but also warned me that Brenda wouldn't go down without a fight. "He's going to escalate this situation, mark my words. But sometimes you have to stand up to bullies even when it gets uncomfortable." Armed with official documentation and growing support from reasonable neighbors, I felt confident enough to issue my own ultimatum. I sent Brenda a certified letter requiring her to remove the dock from my property within 48 hours and cease all harassment related to non-existent HOA violations. I included copies of the county records clearly showing property boundaries and the legal permits for all structures on my land. Looking back, I realized I probably should have expected her response to be anything but reasonable and proportionate. Miss Brenda decided to play dirty, and she was about to learn that some games have consequences she never anticipated. When your property rights are being challenged, there's nothing quite like hiring a professional surveyor to settle the matter once and for all. I reached out to Bartholomew Wilson, a licensed surveyor with 40 years of experience who came highly recommended by the county clerk's office. When he arrived at my cabin on a crisp Tuesday morning, he brought GPS units, metal detectors, the lights, and measuring chains. Bartholomew himself was a tall, thin man with weathered hands and the kind of methodical precision you'd want in someone whose job involves measuring things down to the inch. "Son," he said as he unloaded his truck, "I've been dealing with situations like this my whole career. Let's get out there and see what the actual boundaries look like." The survey process took the better part of 3 days. Bartholomew and his young assistant Tommy started by locating the original survey markers that my grandfather's surveyor had placed back in 1965. Using the metal detector, they found the first iron rod buried under nearly 6 decades of leaf, litter and soil accumulation about 30 ft into what the current neighbors considered community forest. Tommy carefully excavated around the marker, while Bartholomew consulted his collection of maps, deed descriptions, and survey notes. "Your grandfather's surveyor was thorough," Bartholomew noted approvingly. "These markers are exactly where they should be according to your deed." As they worked their way around the property perimeter, the scope of the boundary discrepancies became increasingly clear. The GPS coordinates from each recovered marker were fed into Bartholomew's tablet computer, which gradually built a detailed map of my actual property lines overlaid with satellite imagery of the current structures. What emerged was shocking. My property didn't just include the cabin and immediate grounds. It extended far beyond what I'd ever imagined, encompassing significant portions of what the HOA had been calling community property for years. The community dock that 4 families had been using for their boats. It was located entirely on my land about 50 ft inside my actual property line. But the encroachments went far beyond just the dock. Brenda's backyard entertainment area, complete with an expensive hot tub, outdoor kitchen, and elaborate deck, extended 15 feet onto my property. The pathway that connected several houses to the waterfront ran almost entirely through my land. Even more shocking was the discovery that the HOA's so-called community area, with its gazebo, playground equipment, and parking area, was located 60% on land that legally belonged to me. Tommy whistled low when Bartholomew showed him the overlay map. Mr. Thompson were talking about major structures built on your land. The most significant discovery came on the third day when they surveyed the waterfront area. Using GPS technology and traditional surveying methods, Bartholomew determined that my property line extended not just to the water's edge, but actually into the lake itself by about 30 ft, following the original shoreline from when my grandfather first purchased the land. This meant that the community swimming area, the boat slips, and even the small beach where neighborhood children played were all technically on my property. The thing about lakefront property, Bartholomew explained, is that the original surveys often included water rights and submerged land that people forget about over time. When Bartholomew presented me with the final survey report, complete with detailed maps, GPS coordinates, and photographic documentation of each boundary marker, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The legal implications were enormous. Not only did the HOA have no authority over my property, but dozens of their most important community features were built on land they had no right to use. The swimming area where children had learned to swim, the dock where families kept their boats, the playground where neighborhood kids played, and even the community center where HOA meetings were held, all sat on Thompson family land. The survey report also revealed that several of the newer houses in the development had been built assuming certain property boundaries that didn't align with legal reality. While most homes were safely within their actual lot lines, a few had features, like driveways, sheds, or landscaping elements that technically encroached on my property. The whole neighborhood had been operating under assumptions about property boundaries that were based on wishful thinking rather than legal documentation. As I reviewed the documentation that Bartholomew provided, I understood why my grandfather had been so meticulous about keeping property records. Every survey marker, every boundary description, every easement and water right was carefully documented and filed with the county. The HOA development had been built around our property without anyone bothering to verify the actual legal boundaries. And now the chickens were coming home to roost. I spent that evening on my dock watching the sunset and contemplating the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The community dock extending into the water beneath my feet, the pavilion visible through the trees, the swimming area where I could hear children playing. All of it was legally mine. I had no desire to be vindictive or cruel to families who had innocently enjoyed these amenities for years. But I also couldn't allow Brenda's harassment to continue based on fictional authority. The next morning, I called Dorothy to share the survey results. Her reaction was immediate. I knew it. I've been watching this neighborhood for 20 years, and something always seemed off about how that HOA claimed ownership of so much waterfront area. She suggested that I should inform Brenda about the findings before word spread through the community gossip network. That afternoon, I called Brenda to inform her that the professional survey had been completed and that there were some significant findings she should be aware of. Her response was, "Kurt, whatever your little survey says, Mr. Thompson, this community has rights that have been established for years. Don't think you can intimidate us with paperwork." Little did she know that her world was about to be turned completely upside down. The news of the survey results hit Brenda like a tsunami, and her reaction was everything I'd expected and more. Within 6 hours of our phone conversation, she had called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, contacted Cornelius Blackwood for legal advice, and begun what could only be described as a full-scale panic campaign throughout the neighborhood. According to Dorothy, who had a front-row seat to the unfolding drama, Brenda spent the entire evening calling board members, key supporters, and anyone else who would listen, her voice growing more shrill and desperate with each conversation. "She's telling people that you're trying to steal community property," Dorothy reported with barely contained amusement. "Apparently, you're some kind of con artist who's forged documents." By the next morning, Brenda had transformed from neighborhood busybody into full conspiracy theorist mode. She began spreading increasingly wild stories about my background and motives, telling anyone who would listen that I was probably working with outside developers who wanted to destroy the community character of Pineridge Estates. She claimed that my environmental background was just a cover story and that I was actually involved in some kind of land speculation scheme. According to various neighbors she contacted, I was simultaneously a government agent trying to seize private property, a criminal who had inherited dirty money, and an environmental terrorist planning to poison the lake. The harassment campaign that Brenda launched was coordinated with military precision and completely unhinged in its scope. She organized what she called property protection patrols, consisting of herself and the most paranoid residents she could recruit, all wearing matching bright orange T-shirts with community defense printed in bold letters. These patrols would drive slowly past my cabin at all hours, taking photographs of my property, my vehicles, and anyone who visited me. They set up folding chairs on what they claimed was the property line and took turns maintaining surveillance of my activities. Brenda herself could often be seen stalking around the perimeter of my cabin with a tablet computer, documenting what she called evidence of property tampering. The psychological warfare tactics escalated quickly from merely annoying to genuinely disruptive and possibly illegal. Brenda filed formal complaints with every government agency she could think of, claiming that my property posed environmental hazards, that I was violating building codes, and that I was somehow contaminating the lake water. She contacted the Department of Natural Resources with false reports about suspicious chemical runoff from my property. She called the fire department multiple times, claiming she'd seen unauthorized burning and potentially dangerous structures. She even contacted the IRS with anonymous tips that I was probably evading taxes. When official complaints failed to produce the results she wanted, Brenda moved on to direct intimidation tactics that revealed just how unhinged she'd become. She began leaving threatening notes on my door, my truck, and even floating in waterproof containers near my dock. These notes, written in her distinctive handwriting with various colored pens and decorated with angry emoticons, accused me of being a community destroyer and property thief. She blocked my driveway with orange traffic cones and posted handmade signs around the neighborhood, warning of dangerous individual and protect your property values. The signs featured unflattering photos of me that she'd apparently taken with a telephoto lens. The rumor mill that Brenda fed went into overdrive, pumping out increasingly bizarre stories about my supposed criminal activities and evil intentions. She told neighbors that I was planning to build a compound on the waterfront that would destroy the peaceful nature of the lake. She claimed that I had connections to radical environmental groups who wanted to sabotage private property rights. She suggested that I was mentally unstable and potentially violent, pointing to my aggressive demands about property lines as evidence of dangerous instability. Some neighbors reported that she'd even suggested I might be involved in drug trafficking. Brenda's campaign reached its peak when she organized what she called an emergency community protection meeting at the community center, which, according to my new survey, was built partially on my property. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening and attended by nearly every resident of Pineridge Estates. Brenda had worked herself into such a state that she could barely speak coherently, alternating between tearful pleas for community solidarity and angry rants about my supposed attempts to steal their way of life. She distributed packets of evidence that included printed emails, copies of the survey report, and photographs of my property with ominous captions. The most telling moment came when Brenda broke down completely in front of the assembled neighbors. "I've put everything into this community," she sobbed, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks. "I've given you all beautiful spaces, protected your property values, maintained standards that keep this place special. And now, some outsider wants to come in and destroy it all with fake papers and legal threats. We can't let him win." and several neighbors looked uncomfortable with her emotional display, particularly when she started demanding that people contribute money to a legal defense fund. Following the community meeting, Brenda's behavior became even more erratic. She began recruiting teenagers from allied families to harass me, paying them small amounts to throw eggs at my cabin and leave garbage on my property. She organized boycotts of local businesses that I frequented, trying to pressure shop owners to refuse me service. She even contacted my few freelance clients with warnings about my unstable mental state and legal troubles, attempting to sabotage my livelihood. The final straw came when Brenda decided to take direct action against what she saw as the source of all her problems, my dock. Late one night, she and two of her most devoted supporters attempted to remove sections of my dock, claiming they were reclaiming community property. Fortunately, the security cameras I'd installed captured the entire incident, including Brenda's distinctive voice directing the operation and her appearance in the bright floral mou she'd worn for the occasion. The next morning, armed with video evidence of trespassing and attempted destruction of property, I was finally ready to take legal action that would end Brenda's reign of terror once and for all. Working with Daniel Park to build a comprehensive, legal case against Brenda and the HOA was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where each piece revealed another layer of deception and misconduct. The legal documents we filed were thorough: cease and desist orders for harassment, formal trespassing charges for unauthorized use of my property, demands for immediate removal of all structures built on my land without permission, and a lawsuit for damages from both the harassment campaign and the illegal commercial activity at the fundraiser. But Daniel had uncovered something even more damaging than simple property boundary disputes. The fundraiser that Brenda had organized violated multiple city ordinances, including requirements for vendor permits, insurance for public events, and authorization for commercial activities. Most importantly, collecting money on private property without the owner's consent was classified as a felony under state law. The deeper we dug into the property history and HOA documentation, the more shocking the revelations became. My grandfather had never signed any agreement transferring any portion of his land to community use, no matter what Brenda and her lawyer claimed. The HOA development had been built under the assumption that they could simply include the waterfront area as community property without any legal basis for that assumption. Even more damning, Brenda had personally signed off on the development plans when she worked as a real estate agent for the original developer, despite having no legal authority to approve anything related to my family's property. For 3 years, the HOA had been illegally collecting fees for community amenities that were actually located on private property they had no right to use. But the most shocking discovery came when Daniel started investigating Brenda's more recent activities. As HOA president, city records showed that she had signed a contract with Lakeside Marine Construction for a $15,000 dock upgrade project, claiming to have full authority over the waterfront area where my dock was located. The contract called for a complete renovation of the existing community dock, including new floating dock systems, boat slips, and even a small pavilion for waterfront gatherings. Construction was scheduled to begin the following month, and Brenda had already submitted partial payment from HOA funds. She had literally contracted to renovate property she didn't own using money collected from neighbors who had no idea their fees were being spent on illegal improvements. When the legal papers arrived via certified mail, Brenda's reaction was even more entertaining than I'd anticipated. According to Chester Davidson, who witnessed the delivery, she opened the envelope on her front porch and immediately started screaming loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. Within hours, she was going door to door trying to organize an emergency dissolution of the HOA, apparently hoping that disbanding the organization would somehow make the legal problems disappear. Her desperation was palpable when she showed up at my door that evening, wearing a pink cardigan with embroidered poodles and a forced smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Lucas, "Surely we can work something out," she said, in a voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm sure we can be reasonable adults about this whole misunderstanding." The real scandal broke wide open when Daniel discovered that city records showed no proper paperwork had been filed for the fundraiser event. And more damning, the $3,000 collected wasn't sitting in any official HOA account. Instead, the money had been deposited into Brenda's personal checking account, where it had remained for over a week without any transfer to HOA funds or allocation to neighborhood improvements. "It appears Mrs. Rutherford decided to pocket the community donations," Daniel explained, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd seen this kind of corruption before. Between the embezzlement, the unauthorized contracts, and the commercial activity on private property, she's looking at serious criminal charges in addition to the civil litigation. The dramatic confrontation that followed was exactly the kind of public spectacle that Brenda had been trying to avoid. Chester Davidson, being a contractor himself, recognized the Lakeside Marine construction trucks when they arrived to begin work on the dock upgrade project. He immediately called me and I rushed down to the waterfront with Daniel's property documentation and a camera to record everything. When I explained to the construction foreman that they were about to commit trespassing and destruction of private property, their reaction was swift and professional. That's when Brenda arrived in her white BMW convertible with the top down, wearing a neon yellow sundress that looked like it had been designed for a beach party rather than a neighborhood crisis. "You can't stop progress," she screamed at me, while the construction workers packed up their equipment. The situation escalated even further when Dorothy's niece, Samantha Wells, who worked as a local news reporter, arrived with a camera crew to cover what she'd heard was an interesting property dispute. Brenda's public breakdown in front of the news cameras was spectacular and completely self-destructive. She ranted about how I was trying to destroy our property values, ruining our way of life, and stealing from hard-working families who just want to enjoy the lake. When Samantha asked about the embezzlement allegations and the unauthorized construction contracts, Brenda's response was to claim that I had manipulated the legal system and was probably in cahoots with crooked lawyers who hate community values. The community reaction to these revelations was swift and decisive. Neighbors who had trusted Brenda with their HOA fees demanded full financial audits of all community accounts. Chester Davidson revealed that Brenda had approached him months earlier about falsifying construction permits. Dorothy produced copies of meeting minutes showing that Brenda had consistently voted herself bonuses and expense reimbursements from HOA funds without board approval. Several families discovered that their monthly HOA fees had been increased without proper notification. The HOA was officially dissolved within 2 weeks, and most neighbors seemed relieved to be free from Brenda's tyrannical leadership style. My final offer to the community was fair and reasonable. I proposed lease agreements that would allow honest neighbors to continue using the dock area for a nominal monthly fee. Daniel filed criminal complaints for embezzlement and fraud, ensuring that she would face personal legal consequences beyond just the civil litigation. Brenda made one final desperate attempt to salvage her situation, but it only sealed her fate more completely. The final court hearing in Millbrook County Courthouse was everything I'd hoped for and more. Judge Patricia Thornfield, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense, reviewed all the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who clearly didn't appreciate having her time wasted by frivolous disputes. After less than an hour of deliberation, she ruled completely in my favor on every single count. The court ordered immediate removal of all unauthorized structures from my property within 30 days, awarded me $15,000 in damages for harassment and illegal use of my land, held Brenda personally liable for all construction contracts and legal mistakes made by the HOA, and required her to pay additional attorney fees that brought her total financial obligation to over $40,000. The judge's final comments were particularly satisfying. This case represents a clear pattern of harassment, financial misconduct, and abuse of community authority. The financial consequences for Brenda were devastating and entirely of her own making. Beyond the damages awarded to me, she faced additional legal fees that continued mounting as criminal charges for embezzlement moved through the system. The HOA's dissolution left her personally responsible for all outstanding contracts and obligations, including the $15,000 dock construction project that never should have been authorized in the first place. To cover these mounting costs, she was forced to put her McMansion on the market for significantly less than she'd paid, and even then, it took months to find a buyer. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that her obsession with protecting property values had ultimately led to the destruction of her own financial stability. Brenda's final public meltdown occurred during what she probably thought would be a graceful exit from Pine Ridge Estates. She showed up at my property with a moving truck and demolition crew, demanding one last chance to talk like civilized people about the court-ordered dock removal. Her appearance was a stark contrast to the meticulously maintained image she'd tried to project as HOA president. She wore a torn grey sweatshirt, flip-flops, and no makeup, with her bleached hair unsaid and mascara staining her cheeks from obvious crying.
"This is all your fault," she shouted while pointing an accusatory finger at me. "I made this neighborhood beautiful. I gave these people pride. You've destroyed everything I worked for. I simply stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching."
The scene unfolded with the detached interest of someone observing a nature documentary. The practical resolution of the community issues turned out to be much simpler than anyone had anticipated. Working with Daniel Park, I developed reasonable lease agreements for families who wanted to continue using the dock area, charging a modest fee of $200 per month per family that was actually less than what they'd been paying in HOA dues. The elimination of Brenda's administrative overhead and questionable financial practices meant that everyone came out ahead financially while gaining access to a properly maintained waterfront facility. Chester Davidson volunteered to handle much of the legal paperwork and coordinate maintenance schedules, grateful to be free from Brenda's arbitrary rule enforcement. My personal victory extended far beyond the legal and financial outcomes. Using some of the damage money, I was able to renovate the cabin exactly as my grandfather would have wanted. With a new deck overlooking the lake, updated electrical systems that maintained the rustic character, and a fully restored dock that would serve the community well for decades to come, I set up a small home office in what had been my grandfather's workshop, complete with environmental monitoring equipment for freelance consulting work. The view of Lake Pine View from my desk every morning reminded me daily of why this place was worth fighting for. 6 months after the court victory, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm that my grandfather would have approved of. My girlfriend, Rebecca, moved into the cabin with me, bringing her own love of nature and peaceful living to our shared space. The new residents who bought Brenda's former house were a young couple named Griffin and Melody, who actually read property agreements before signing them and contributed positively to community life without trying to control everyone around them. Dorothy Weatherby became not just a neighbor, but a genuine friend who often joined me for evening fishing trips where we'd share stories about the old days. The final twist came from a letter my grandfather had left in that sealed envelope, which I discovered during my initial research but hadn't opened until after everything was resolved. His handwritten note, dated just months before his death, showed remarkable foresight. Lou written, "I've seen some suspicious surveying activity around the property lately, and I suspect someone might try to claim parts of our land after I'm gone. If anyone ever challenges your ownership, stand your ground. The deed and survey records are all filed properly with the county. Remember, if someone tries to take what belongs to you, fight back, but always fight fair. Always fight smart." And remember that the truth has a way of coming out when you need it most. So the next time someone tries to intimidate you with fancy letterhead and legal threats, remember that sometimes the little guy has bigger guns than anyone realizes. Property rights matter. The truth generally prevails when properly documented, and bullies like Brenda usually defeat themselves if you give them enough rope. As for Miss Brenda Rutherford herself, last I heard, she'd moved to Boca Raton, Florida, where she was reportedly trying to become president of another homeowners association. I genuinely wish her new neighbors luck in dealing with whatever schemes she's undoubtedly cooking up in her new tropical setting. If you enjoyed this story about standing up to neighborhood bullies and the sweet satisfaction of justice being served, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. Have you ever had to deal with an overzealous HOA or similar situation? Share your own David versus Goliath moments, because I'm willing to bet there are plenty of other stories out there about people who stood up to authority figures who had no real authority at all.